avoid gesticulating.
Well, no, that's the thing. It's
I
so
do that a
cool,
lot.
isn't it?
Let's see if I can. I've had them on since I was like 14.
Oh, no, don't worry about that then.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just have to accept the jangle.
They're a family. My grandma has them. My mom has them. We pass them down the women in the family. So taking them off feels a little... I don't want to.
Well, yeah, if we're going to keep the jangly bracelets on then so it's an heirloom, is it?
Yeah, they're sort of my grandma... I guess it's...
Let's hear them then. Let's hear them. Yeah.
So that was a sound of comfort for me when I was younger.
Wow.
Because, you know, when you lose your parents or you lose your mum, it's the scariest thing when you're little. And I would just hear this and I knew, oh, she's close, I'm okay. You know, in the supermarket or these places that seem impenetrable and vast, that was always something that was a comfort. And my grandma's ones are so worn down now that they're super thin. So the jangling sound has changed as she's gotten older as well.
I see.
It's like a softer, lighter jingle.
So this is almost like a female family heirloom.
It's, organically become that. It wasn't ever a sort of a plan, but my family has traveled around for many generations for different works. For example, my granddad worked for the Dutch embassy after the war. And so my grandma and my granddad on my mum's side moved every couple of years. So my mum was born in Syria, then they moved to Guatemala, Morocco, Libya.
Wow.
Yeah, and in some of those countries, for example, in Morocco, it's quite normal for people to wear their bracelet. You know, it's quite a sort of cultural norm to wear the bracelets on your wrist. And there's quite a lot of bartering society. So you used to take a bracelet off, exchange it for things. And I think that's something that organically sort of was incorporated into the family a little bit, being based in these places. But my mum's had hers on since she was 7. And so she physically can't take them off anymore because her wrist has grown. And her hand has grown, and so they won't go over her hand anymore. And mine I've had since I was 14, so not quite as long, but still long enough that I don't actually remember what it feels like not to have that acoustic sound alongside.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing and appropriate on lots of different levels.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I knew you were fairly international. Kenya, we'll get into all that, but I didn't realize you had such a rich tapestry in your recent history. Isla Davidson?
Isla Keijse Davidson.
Keijse Davidson.
Keijse's for my granddad. It means little Kees. His name was Kees. So I like to use it as much as I can.
Isla Keijse Davidson. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
On the first transatlantic Listening With podcast, video podcast, which I forgot to mention to you about the video. So thanks for accommodating us.
No problem.
Yeah, really special. We've had an amazing day. We've been talking about loads of exciting things over the last few months. So I'm really, really glad to catch you on this podcast. But why don't you tell us, just because we're not at the farm, which is where I record most of these episodes, where are we?
Yeah, so I guess right now, beside a pond that, if we're thinking about what we listen to, is quite a significant place. It's, if you expand a little further out, it's in a town called Ithaca, or city called Ithaca in upstate New York, where Cornell University is based. So we're about a couple of hours drive, which you know from experience, from New York City.
Yeah.
And this particular spot where we're sat right now at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but also the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, is some of the places where the first recordings of wild birds were ever taken. So we've seen some of the big equipment that people used to go out with and try to actually document some of these wild sounds and soundscapes that we're hearing around us. So, and from that, the sort of evolution of bioacoustics and exploring that and studying that formally and going from terrestrial spaces, so on land, underwater, this has been quite a big space that's worked on that.
And so just 2 words, but then I want to expand out a little bit and get into a little bit of a creative zone. Ornithology. Define that for people.
So ornithology is the study of birds, which is fun for me because I'm a marine biologist, right? So when I came here, I'm really trying my best to learn the different bird species. It's been a really fun way of being humbled when you come to a place and you're learning afresh what's around you, and also a really nice way to kind of settle into the ecosystem here. So I was telling you earlier that when I first got here, it was still sort of the waking up from winter, I'd say. There were no leaves. And I realized as I was getting situated that as the leaves started to come out, that we're both new here. The leaves and me were sort of figuring it out growing into our space. So I feel like it's been a really nice way of slowly recognizing what I'm hearing around me, seeing the species for the first time and figuring it out and really seeing, okay, I'm part of this ecosystem and trying to settle in that way.
And as we walked around the pond or lake really size, it's incredible bird song that I hear all around, and it's interesting for me because it feels quite like England, but then it's just not. Actually, the bird song's quite a bit different. We've got chipmunks running around rather than little field mice, and it's almost like just a slightly alternate reality because it doesn't feel so vastly different as the island I was on last week or anything like that. But yeah, it must be interesting thinking, a bit familiar and entirely new at the same time.
Yeah, I think some of the cases where that's particularly fun is they have a robin here, right? An American robin. But when you see it, it looks nothing like the robin we're used to. It definitely doesn't sound anything like the robin we're used to. And so you have these little, and it's an interesting pocket of history, I suppose, as well, because a lot of people who came and settled here will have been finding things that felt familiar to them and comforts of a long distant home. And so you sort of wonder in the naming, why is the robin the robin? Is it because it has a slightly orange breast and that's the comparison, or is it something else?
And one more technical question before we expand out a little bit. Bioacoustics.
So bioacoustics is basically studying biological sound. So it doesn't have to be a living thing if you think waves crashing against a shore. But bioacoustics tends to be when we're listening to the sounds created by other creatures around us, be that on land or underwater.
And you mentioned the Merlin ID app, and we've been using it on this podcast as the bird feed. We've been recording the bird song at the farm, chopping it up into little segments and feeding it through Merlin so we can figure out how many different birds are at the farm and get to know that over time through the seasons and etc. But this is actually where that started, isn't it? Around this pond. That was where not only the first recordings in history, but probably the first recordings for the Merlin ID app. And this is really one of the global hubs, isn't it, for bioacoustic ornithology. If I can add those together.
Yeah. I think this is a really exciting space just for the reason you said, that it was somewhere where people were really exploring that world of sound early on, but also because of that, it became this central space for a lot of that discovery. A lot of people were drawn here because they wanted to learn about some of the newest tech, which when we look at it now, it's these big bulky devices, but at the time they were really high tech. And also just the biology that comes with that, right? So you've got the technology that kind of needs to intermingle with your understanding of the biology of what you're hearing. What does that even mean? Why is that bird calling in this particular context? And how can we understand what the sounds actually translate to? And so this has been a place for that and that learning for decades. Yeah.
I'm very pleased to be here and to be talking with you about it all. And we've had so many good conversations today with Aaron, with Ben, with Matt. I think that's it. And then some nice chance conversations in the hallway with Isabella and Masha, who are, and we won't go into those today because we want to talk together in the room. But just for me, it's been a great experience to, within a few hours, to span hardware, software, deep sea listening, 300 meters down with ROVs, thinking about the origins of this whole space with Aaron and how it relates to the marine, how the birds relate to marine, and thinking through some of the ways to be useful as well with acoustics. How can we connect in and solve problems that really matter to the science community, with Ben as well. So it's a load for me to think about as I drive 3-4 hours back to JFK tomorrow. Before we go any further and talk more about listening itself and get into your history of training and what you know about, been playing a little game with people that come on the show.
Okay, cool.
And basically what we have here is a mixture of cards that have shapes on them and some cards that have some numbers on them.
Okay.
And I've been asking people to just pick 3 cards, flip them over, and even if it takes a minute or two of sitting in silence, just see what pops to mind. Like, what we're interested in is to get to know you just for a couple of minutes, not through the story, the CV, the kind of the hero moments of awards or, you know, titles, but just a bit like really what you shared with us about the jangling bracelets, something that just gives us an insight into you a little bit and see if anything pops to your mind. So you can pick however you like. Would you like to, you can have 3 cards. Would you like, got different names for them, but essentially they're the shape cards or the number cards. Explain what you're looking at if you want, or if something comes to your mind, just dive straight in and tell us what it is.
Well, we've got some, I'll start with the first one I picked out. It's a series of triangles pointing inwards to form this nice sort of, I guess I'm seeing like a square with the interconnections in between and the triangle pieces coming together to form the square. Then we've got what I instantly thought of as a moon, although it's slightly wrong angle. So it looks like a big smiley face, I suppose, if you pictured a moon in its phase shifts. And then the inevitable, what to me instantly strikes as ocean waves, 3 squiggling lines across the card.
And so as we sit with it, just if anything comes to mind that's like a moment or an experience in your life that comes out of these pretty abstract cards, then we'd love to hear it.
For this one, it doesn't strike up a memory as much or an association. It's more, I am a very visual person, and so the shapes and the patterns and looking at how these shapes are kind of forming together is something that I find pleasing, and I can kind of see the motion in it, and I like the idea of how I've always been someone who's had to create big mind maps and draw. I used to, like when I studied for exams, I used to draw out my exams to get a feel for what were the answers, what were the things I was thinking, the connection points. And so this kind of felt like that movement in a sketch, in a drawing. And the moon, what I'm going to call the moon, which also could be a big smiley face, is I think links a lot to me to some very profound friendships that I have in French Polynesia and the Marquesa Islands, which is the archipelago sort of on the northernmost collection in French Polynesia. And there I had and have a really good friend who's not based there right now, but is a Marquesian, real Marquesian gentleman. And we would go and just watch the different phases of the moon reflect over the ocean and just reflect on how we might come from totally different backgrounds and physically global points on our planet, and yet have these feelings of exploration of connectedness and what is it to be a person intermingling in an environment that's a lot of wild as well.
Amazing. And not that the objective of the game is for me to comment, but I do find it fascinating with that first one with the 4 triangles facing in, that what you see is a square, because the square there isn't a square there is 4 triangles. But I do think it says, as you said, it makes sense to me that it says something about the way you think, because you're looking at the whole, even in the voids. It takes the voids and the shapes in order to sort of get to what you were talking about, which actually, to be fair, has been my experience of our conversations. One thing I've appreciated has been your ability to point out the parts that might be missing from, a bit of a speech that I had written that you looked over, or something. I think it might be that I'm thinking of specifically. And that is not an easy skill, to be able to see into the void what's missing from something, and sort of to sort of say, oh, maybe you could consider this, or maybe you're narrowing it down and broadening it out this way. So I found that to be, and maybe it's a very good academic skill. That's probably what you academics do for each other, by sort of trying to critique each other's work and help. But I find it incredibly helpful when someone can see bits that might be not present in the work that I'm creating.
No, I appreciate that. And actually, I it's funny, I know that I'm in an academic space, and I'm navigating an academic world, but I don't necessarily consider myself an academic person in the sense that I don't know if that interweaves into my identity or the way that I think that strongly. And maybe that's just because when you're in an environment, you also understand how many different people kind of connect into it through different directions. Or it might also just be that I feel like a little bit of an oddball sometimes.
What do you perceive to be an academic way of thinking or being then? And therefore, what would you deem as typically outside of that?
So I think that's part of what I'm still figuring out. So I don't think I have, unfortunately, a fully fledged answer for you on that. But I think that what I'm learning more and more is that actually the academic space is a mixture of what each of us kind of carves for ourselves and the community that we work with. But I also think that it's how you strive for discovery and how much that's interconnected with the knowledge that's come before you. So I think that one thing that's really wonderful about the academic space, and I think is a kind of presence throughout at least everybody that I've interacted with, is you are constantly aware that you're building on this knowledge, this experience that's taken generations worth of people and their life's work and their life's passion and their life's effort to understand and to explore and to grow on. And I kind of like how it in some ways feels a bit like a coral reef. You know how corals are constantly, the new generation is growing on the skeletal structure of their ancestors from hundreds of thousands of years. And so I kind of like the idea that we're building off this knowledge, this skeletal structure from those that have studied or explored it in the past. And sometimes it shifts and we move with the time and the currents at the time. And sometimes we just keep getting into that depth of knowledge that we weren't able to harness before. And I think that goes, in some ways, that is not necessarily academic. I think you can pursue that and understand that without being in a quote unquote academic space. So people have been doing that within local communities in different environments where they share their knowledge and the exchange and the experiences go across generations. That doesn't have to have any association with a university, for example. That's existed way before universities did. So that's what I mean sometimes, how some of these core elements to being in an academic space are not exclusive to an academic space.
Normally, I invite guests to bring a sound into the room. But that is something I have forgotten to ask you, isn't it? Yeah. Like some people have, used their voice or bought an instrument or played a song on Spotify for us to actually have a moment of listening.
I mean, to be honest, I think the bangle sound is an acoustic link that I think just speaks for what I think I would add to that is just that many of us probably have these acoustic links with many people we love that we're not necessarily always recognizing we're hearing. And I think that what I like and sometimes forget, because I don't hear myself, I don't hear this.
I see.
I'm so used to it that I don't hear it.
It's background for you.
But I hear the acoustic signature of it for my mother and for my grandmother. And so you have this comforting connection of someone being themselves and living their life, and they're important for you. And you don't even realize that it's there. It's in your, it's a soothing sound that you're picking up. And I just think that is something that probably many people have, whether it's the particular way someone paces down the corridor versus their laugh versus the way that you can sometimes even hear that someone's smiling over the phone if you know them well enough. There's a certain sound of the way we connect with each other that I think is brings a lot of comfort and just highlights how much we're listening into each other even when we're not aware of it.
I think you make a really interesting point about I'm going to call it home, where when we're at home and we're not doing our thing, adventuring, sciencing, whatever it might be, you're trying to relax, you're trying to reroute yourself, restitch yourself back to your own story, rest, recuperate, etc. It's not always this kind of direct communication that you're having. It's the ambient kind of togetherness. And actually, I totally see what you mean, that in that context, the sound signatures of home are probably deeply comforting, just telling us they're still here. I certainly know that my wife likes to know I'm in the house, but doesn't always want to talk to me. If I talk about like going out for a walk or something, why are you leaving? You know, but no, don't talk to me. You're fine over there. Like, and there is that comfort of just being near each other.
Yeah.
There's like a sonic range, which is just maybe a bit broader or wider than that kind of conversational and visual range. And I've not really considered that yet, but what are your sound signatures of home?
Yeah. Well, it's, we know and recognize nonverbal communication is a really important way in which we connect with each other. But I think we then automatically assume that it's gestures or maybe a visual sign. We don't necessarily then consider you can have many acoustic nonverbal forms of communication that are sounds, definitely, but they're not words. And I think what I really like about that and what I find really interesting about that is when you're exploring, let's say, the nonverbal form of communication, you're getting into a way of connecting with non-human species as well. What's the animal behavior? What's being communicated across senses? When I watch this goose following its mom walking towards the pond, there's so much going on there. When you're paying attention to that non-verbal element, I think that there's something really in connecting about the fact that you can be looking at that from, trying to interpret another species, but that doesn't take away any of the relevance of how we're doing that with each other across human to human interaction as well.
It's making me think, like, what are my bangle sounds that make me know that I'm home and feeling comforted. I'll take that away with me and consider it a little bit more. So on that journey of sort of observing animal behavior through, I mean, it's a great time to ask about your actual field of study before I say too much and bastardize it. So what is, how do you explain, obviously it gets narrower to some degree as you go through your various stages. You're now Dr. Isla.
Fresh,
Keejse
brand
Davidson.
new, brand new. Yeah.
I should have introduced you like that, but sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I'm still getting used to it myself. Yeah. I guess I would start with, I have spent at least the last 5 years exploring how different animals use a variety of their senses to communicate with each other. And how sometimes when we look at these interactions between species or within the same species, how that can happen across different senses. So, whether it's sound or smell or visual. And then also, how are these interactions shifting as the world is changing a lot, and especially as these oceans are shifting as well. So I was focusing across coral reef environments and looking mainly at fish, so coral reef fish. But that's where I sort of started exploring and considering, okay, first of all, how are we looking at the diversity of these interactions that are happening every day on these incredibly busy ecosystems, and then trying to understand how are they changing and what does that mean for that health of that ecosystem, the integrity of the functions of that ecosystem. And one of the senses that I was exploring, just because it is a really important one underwater, is sound. A lot of these fish are interacting acoustically with each other. And so through that, I started to learn more about the importance of sound, how we can learn when we listen, and what we can learn when we listen, and how we can inform our efforts to conserve some of these environments by listening and by their voice, actually. So understanding a bit more about how do we translate what we're hearing, and what that can mean for protection of these marine environments. And it was very organic. You know, none of these things were written down plans that I'd ever made. It was very much from conversations with people like Steve, who was giving lectures in my my undergrad.
What was your undergrad then?
So my undergrad was biology, biosciences. Right. So I loved, having grown up in Kenya. My mum is a wildlife conservationist and my dad's a wildlife photographer and filmmaker. And so they traveled a lot for their work. And when I was young, I would come with them. And I think, you know, it's probably safe to say as a family, we were very engaged in the natural environment. And so I had, from a very young age, this curiosity and this opportunity to explore that curiosity of, why is this creature doing this? What is going on here? And I think that evolved that interest. I didn't know exactly which direction I wanted to take it in, but I knew I wanted to learn more and see what I could do that might have a positive impact in terms of protecting some of these environments. Yeah. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll start with biology, biosciences. And when I was having these lectures, I was taking a marine biology module. And I've always loved being in the sea, exploring the sea. I'm always the first one in, the last one out, if I can help it. And Steve Simpson was one of my undergraduate lecturers for the marine course. And he teases me now because he says I used to sit right at the front of the class. I'd have all the questions and I'd come running up after the class and he wouldn't be able to get away. Yeah. And I think it was just that, you know, once you're at, if you're lucky enough to be doing an undergraduate, then you're at this forefront of discovery and knowledge. And I just wanted to know more and wanted to keep exploring. And so once the lecture was done, I'd be like, well, what do you think of Professor Steve? What do you think about this or that? And it was from some of those conversations, and I guess that excitement of learning more that we figured out, well, why don't you look at coral reef clownfish and try to understand what do some of the sounds that they make actually mean? And it just kind of kept evolving from that way. And so now here at Cornell in the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, where we're really trying to take our understanding of not only particular sounds that we hear certain individuals make, but whole soundscapes. So the whole acoustic landscape that you might be recording underwater. How can we learn more about animal behavior, biodiversity, ecosystem health from just the sounds that we're picking up? And what we're doing now is every World Oceans Day, which is this great, you know, the UN's World Oceans Day is a real great way of galvanizing that attention to the ocean. We are trying to do a World Oceans Passive Acoustic Monitoring Project, which means we put down these hydrophones all across the world, all on World Oceans Day together, so that on that day, as many people who want to are listening in to the sounds, not only the sounds of the sea, but the sounds underwater. And so this year we had more than 180 different people all come together to help, and we were listening to more than 400 locations around the world.
That's amazing. And that's more than last year, which was the first year, wasn't it?
Yeah, last year was the first year we were trying it. And what's been really exciting is that this has been a space where the bioacousticians, so that community of people who have become really experts in exploring sound, have sort of come together and said, yeah, we'll help you with WPAM, you know, the World Oceans Passive Acoustic Monitoring. Let's do it. Let's go. Let's see what we can do.
And as you've pointed out to me, and I've learned a lot from this, that's no small thing when your whole career, everything you've worked for, your love, your passion, all depends on you being able to, you as a marine acoustician, the people in the WPAM network depend on those recordings as the core gold in their research. That is what will earn them their career and help them feed their families. And so for them to be willing to share with the group what bits of what they're recording, says a lot about the collaborative nature of this community, really.
Yeah, I think it says a huge amount about the people who those 180 plus people that they stepped forward, you know, especially if you think, like you said, we started last year. So, you know, arguably they don't know who we are, or they don't know what we're really trying to do. We haven't yet been able to show them because we've only just started, and that they're willing to really step forward and be part of something and put that effort in, and also that energy, that thought, that inspiration and that hope into this moment, and to decide to step in together without really knowing where it's going to go is amount of trust and also an amount of passion that comes from each of those individuals. And some of them have access to 50 recorders, some have access to one, and they come with the same energy and desire to be part of something that could be a really interesting window into one day across this breadth of the planet. And I think that really speaks to the people who've been part of this community so much. You know, I find it very inspirational, but also just very hope inspiring, because it's not always an easy environment to be focusing on. You know, coral reefs are, as an ecosystem, struggling extremely. And so, as you said in your speech for the UN World Oceans Day, you know, they're an ecosystem that if we can do something to protect them, then we're kind of showcasing what we can do as a species. What an incredible thing we can reach. And so I find that really inspiring when you're faced with all these different people who are coming from literally all over the world, and they're willing to take that step and to try something.
Yeah, it's really cool. And yeah, it was a real honor to be able to represent that a little bit at the UN. It's a funny space, the UN, because in some ways, you know, big groups are like really responding to the fact that we had a bit of airtime there, but in another sense, it's means nothing. You guys are the ones doing the real work in the network of WPAM and in their individual research. In probably over 100 universities represented as well, wasn't there? So, but nevertheless, it takes, you know, like Ben said earlier, something like for an eye to evolve, lots of things have to come into action and work together. Yeah. And I thought it was a really interesting metaphor. And in the same way, I just saw a massive splash in the pond, but I thought it was a fish, but now I can see it's a bird, so less like crazy. I was like, you've got sharks in there. But in the same way, you know, you've got to have lots of different moving pieces to try and get the attention that's needed to expand the area and to get the right funding in and continue to make sure all the good work moves forwards. Just
to have different perspectives, you know, I think it's really important to... Some of the conversations that have been really inspiring have also been from people who come from a totally different background, and you know, they might be like, okay, that's cool, the analysis that you're thinking of doing, that's great, but have you considered how you're going to integrate this into some ongoing conservation strategies? And then you're like, oh, that's a really good point. We need to definitely invest a bit of our passion and time into finding the most effective way we can do that. And the conversations lead to evolutions of things that actually are really meaningful and important too. And you might not necessarily get there either as fast or as meaningfully if you're just taking all the steps as a particular circle of expertise. So I think it's that organic interlink of that exchange of experience and knowledge that's really exciting as well. Yeah, definitely. There is one more thing that I'd like to throw in. I don't normally talk about anything practical on here, but seeing as it's World Ocean Day and I'm just being immersed in these conversations, I want to chuck it in because I think for me, 3 things have come out of the conversations with the rest of the gang here for us doing the acoustics work, as in the acoustics with a Q work, to try and figure out. And I think the first thing is, can we support you and the other marine ecologists with something that you describe as the fish classifier, the fish finder? You know, firstly, can we add something useful that makes the work easier?
that's the best way to build trust and relationship, isn't it? By being useful. And the fish finder idea that you've talked about, I think, is our best shot at that, where if we can take an unclassified file, so a recording that's just been made, and then throw back, once it's been run through our system, something that says, oh, this event was interesting, and then we think there was five other events that looked similar, that could help accelerate people's research. So I think can we be useful is one thing. The second thing, I think, is can we be trusted as an organization? There's not many. How can scientists trust that a business will be around for long enough and do the right thing with any data that's submitted, because it is this gold? And yeah, fundamentally those two things. And I think the third thing that Aaron talked about was the indexing of sonic data. Can you make a good filing system, a good sonic library that means that even with petabytes of data, that it's still easy enough to find the relevant information, whether that's by geography or depth of recording or type of recording device or fish species or whatever it may be. And so for me, just sort of almost an internal work thought, rather than broadly looking philosophically at listening, but capture it whilst I have the chance. I think those three things are the challenge that I've taken from today.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a good summary, or would you throw something else in?
I think that no, I would agree with that. In general, I think that a few things that I would probably add is, firstly, I guess this is an opportunity we have, which is really something I think really exciting, but it's a space where everybody within, let's say, for example, the WPAM collaborator community has an opportunity to raise their voice. So I don't want to say this is what we need, because that's my voice. That has no guarantee that is what everybody thinks. So for example, just an example, that fish finder would be very useful for many people who are looking at bioacoustics underwater, because fish are something that has been not as extensively studied as, for example, whales. So we know a lot less about the different sounds that we're picking up. And it's something that lots of people are trying to disentangle in these different soundscapes. But there'll be certain experts who work on, for example, humpbacks. And so a fish finder isn't going to be exactly what someone like that needs. But when you open up that conversation, you find how you can adapt those things to be relevant for everyone. So that's where I think is also really exciting, is you start with this beginning point of the conversation, and then it backs and forths, and it can take all these different forms and shapes that then actually create more of that trust, because it's not only being useful, it's being reliable, and it's that you come back and you're still there, and that you are transparent and honest, and that they know then through that you've said, okay, you've said you want to work on this, we've come back with, that's really interesting, but can we make this possible? And then that happens. And once that gets established within the community, then people know, okay, this is something where I can have this conversation, I can put this in energy forward, because you're really listening, and we're really having this conversation. And I think that what can sometimes be hard is, if I go, at least speaking for the WPAM community, it's a really passionate community that desperately wants, at least one of the things that I would be confident in saying they're passionate about is wanting to do something that can help with better understanding these environments, and then being able to better protect these environments. And so these motivations unify a lot of the individuals that are collaborating. And we don't necessarily know that someone who is coming from a very different context has these same guiding principles or priorities. And that's where it's then harder to know, well, are you also working towards this, or are you working towards something totally different? And I think that conversation makes that apparent, just like it has been in talking with you. But you need to have that conversation before you establish that.
Exactly. If I may zoom out, I'd love to get back to this sort of sense of listening and ask you to attack that word in any way that you see fit. So I don't need to frame the question for you, but just to continue to pull out that theme in one way or another, I'd love to hear what it means to you in some capacity.
Yeah. I mean, we can constantly revisit, reshape, but I think one thing that when I think about how I've engaged, at least with the way I try to understand the work that I do, so you could call that research, but I think it's, listening is integral and essential to any learning. I mean, we're doing that from very first beginnings when you're told, watch out, hot or something, you know, you're learning, okay, I'm associating that, I avoid this, I'm learning to be careful in this space. But I think that, when we look at traditionally what research was across many disciplines, but if I go into the examples that I feel connected with, understanding the natural world, a lot of that started with observational research. You go out there, you see what is around you, and from that you start to understand a bit better. But that's not just watching something, that's active listening as well. And I think that if you're making observations in a natural environment, how do you connect with those observations? How do you listen and notice some of the patterns of what you're seeing? How do you recognize what might be a link between this species and this behavior, and how essential that is for their survival, or how they are essential for the survival of all these other species? I think that listening is completely integrated into how we actually make sense of that. So I think that it's part of, at the very core of what we actually do when we try to understand the world around us. So I think listening is that link to discovery.
It almost seems to me that senses carry with them a paradigm of knowing, a way of connecting, or a way of knowing. And there's something, and smell, for example, also has its own way of knowing that it knows something about chronology that vision and sound doesn't. About, you can smell something that occurred an hour ago that's still lingering in the room. So there's a knowingness about smell, I think, that knows something that sound and vision don't. But I think there's something that listening knows, I don't know if I can say it the right way, but about nuanced learning that's low cost learning as opposed to high cost learning. Does that make any sense what I'm trying to get at?
I think so. I think that we're inherently multisensory. So each of these different senses that we have are meaningful to us in different ways, and we connect with them in different ways. And I think that, for example, us as humans, we tend to often assume that vision, our sense of sight, is our most informative. If you think of a lot of information that we're getting day to day. But I don't think necessarily that having that vision is going to instantly connect us more. And I think sometimes sound does that in a personal way that we feel before we think about. So for example, just to go to what you were saying, I think that, yes, on the touch it's hot example, we might need to watch someone doing it or do it ourselves to have that real empathy with what's going on. But equally, if we hear someone crying because of the pain from that, we maybe haven't seen what happened, we maybe haven't seen the burn event at all, but we can feel that pain just from the sound of that they're exchanging. So I think it's also how we connect, and I think that comes into the side of storytelling in a way. If you're trying to convey something, so if you're trying to say, for example, oh, you need to be careful of this, it can get really hot, you can burn yourself. There are thousands of different ways in which you can communicate that across sound, but also across all of our senses. And I think you're right that some of them will connect to each of us in different ways. Smell is a really interesting one that you bring up, because I'm sure many people have had the experience where you suddenly have a smell that you didn't really expect coming your way, and it takes you straight back to a memory of childhood, and you're just like, wow, that just took me there involuntarily. I was there. And that's really powerful, you know, and really emotive. And I think that seeing something doesn't necessarily do that in the same way. So I think that our sense of connection across these senses, or our connection across these senses, is very personal, but then equally very diverse in how it works. And so each of us is learning what will be that connection point for the other, or what is that connection point for me. And so which of the senses kind of sifts into that more eloquently.
I agree with all of the personalness. And I was talking a couple of weeks ago with Jill Peirce about seeing synesthesia, or the identity of being a synesthete, as a normal human attribute, homo synesthete, as opposed to a divergent, unusual kind of attribute of a human. Because I think not only the sense of the senses, but the relationship between the senses will be a very unique algorithm for everyone. However, having said that, there is also an objective part of all of this, which is, and seen most easily in computation, where to move a 1-minute video file is a lot more data than it is to move a 1-minute audio file. And I understand that vision takes a lot of power, a lot of energy to do vision. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of brain power to do vision. I think it takes less brain power and less watts of energy to do hearing or listening.
You mean through technology or through us?
No, I'm thinking about our body now.
Okay.
But I think if I stuck with the technology, I think it's even more obvious. I think you can run a radio a lot more easily than you can run a TV. So I think there is, and we'd have to check the stats on all that, but assuming that's true, there's a deeply personal and, individually algorithmic part of this. And there's also a sense of an objective part where certain senses have certain requirements of the system. And I think, for example, being able to listen to the radio or a podcast whilst driving might be to do with the nature of the task, but it might also be to do with how much of our resources it requires to do the listening compared to how much it requires to do the driving, to do visioning. I
have never really thought about it in that way. It's an interesting point. I don't know, like cognitively, how much something visual demands versus something audible. I wonder a little bit, it's also our sentient bias as well. Is our technology reflecting our visual bias? So we've developed that and to a level of sophistication because there's a certain amount of we focus on it. Maybe we're more interested in it. Maybe we've been more driven to develop that. Or is it also a question of how actively engaged are you in listening, for example? So you can listen to a podcast while you're driving, or for example, if I'm listening to something while I'm cycling, I might suddenly hear the birds or even notice something next to me, and suddenly, yes, I'm listening, but how much am I really listening? How much am I really absorbing it? Equally, I have some friends who will sit down and listen to a song, and they will sink into the song. They're really listening in a way that I know many other people just love to have it on in the background while they're cooking. So I think maybe you're right that there's a certain amount of sensory dominance that is required if we're actively doing a visual task, because you can't multitask it to the same extent. But I don't think that necessarily means that those deeper listenings don't have that same profound connection. But I don't know. I haven't considered that much.
Well, and I'm pretty sure that somebody who studies the brain will be able to add something interesting into this conversation. Because some of the things I'm reaching for and not quite remembering the specifics on, I think have come from previous works on the brain. And so that will be nice to add that in. But I guess I'm intrigued by the ways of knowing that the different senses archetype, because, you know, I read a quote the other day from the deep listening lady whose name escapes me, where she says, take a walk at night, walk so carefully that your feet become ears. And so in that quote, to me, there is a sense that the listening, or the hearing paradigm, is it a model? It's more of a metaphor. It's more of a kind of, it's transposing the idea across to your feet because it says something about the way of walking. Do you see what I mean? And I think I'd like to consider all of the senses in that way, to think, well, what is it that vision does that's so, you know, fantastic that we could learn to smell better if we could, you know what I mean? How can they all benefit each other by understanding them truly?
I think it's a really interesting exercise as well. You know, one of the, I was once encouraged to listen, just sit down and listen to the environment, but really try to visualize where they're coming from. So where's that sound coming from? And so I would sit down and I would hear a bird, you know, sort of a upper left corner of my, let's say my field of vision, and eyes are closed, and I would just imagine a shape or a color or a pattern associated with that sound, and suddenly I hear a little rustling in the lower right hand corner. That takes a completely different shape and pattern, and I don't know whether that's because I'm quite used to seeing sound waves depending on the acoustic signature, or whether it's just this organic little difference, and that is in some ways I'm adding a visualization to what I'm hearing. But what that did is, I think it heightened my sense of hearing and my awareness of the hearing, because suddenly I was aware of, I'm not just getting one unit of sound coming my way, I'm actually getting a whole tapestry that's interweaving around me with different volumes, with different, you know, sort of different intensities or different textures to it. And so I think you're right that it's not only how mindfully we're engaging with each sense, it's also how we let them interweave into each other. And I think being open to the fact that there's some information that we get from each one that's perhaps unique, that we can't get from the other senses. But I think there's probably a certain amount of overlay that they're sharing, and so actually you can get a more enriched experience when you consider how they overlay.
Okay, so this is all amazing stuff. I guess I've got one more question for you, and then an open one of just, is there anything else that you'd like to share with anybody who's listening? Also, we've barely talked about any of your actual, you know, day-to-day work. So if there's anywhere that you want to point people to, like to see more about you and what you do and how to find your stuff, then do that. But I guess a question for you, really, like, where can you point to where there was a learning moment in your journey through listening, whether in your research or otherwise, that sort of where you suddenly, it was a bit of a revelatory moment where either about yourself or about the thing you were observing, the animal or fish that you were observing, where it kind of messed with your paradigm of understanding, you know, or in some way was impactful?
It's hard to speak of one moment in particular, because I think you have many sort of incremental moments that can kind of gradually create this wave of impact in your life. I think that some of the examples that I have found I keep reflecting on are when you're in a space that's not dominated by humans or what humans have created. So let's say I'm underwater and I'm snorkeling along a coral reef. I would often try to do that early in the morning to see this they have a dawn chorus in coral reefs, just like they do in the forests with the wildlife that's waking up, starting their day, and being sure everyone can hear it. They have the same thing underwater, and that's also this peak of activity. And so when you're interested in animal behavior, I thought this would be a great time. So before doing my research, I would wake up pre-sunrise, get myself down to the seaside and strap on my goggles and my mask. And then as the sun is rising, I'd start to watch some of this activity. And I think being aware of the noise you make as an animal in this space and how other animals are detecting you and trying to interpret you. Mm-hmm. Are you dangerous? Are you safe? What are you doing? What are you signaling to me? Little things, for example, watching how a cleaner wrasse, this small blue and black fish that cleans hundreds of fish every day, so it's really important for the coral reef ecosystem. They have a bunch of little signals that they use to sort of advertise their service, to be like, I'm here to clean. So, they do a little dance, and the fish that come to get cleaned also tilt themselves in a particular way.
Really?
Yeah, to be like, okay, I'm here, and I know I'm normally a predator, but I'm not going to eat you.
Oh, wow.
Just come and clean me. And I noticed,
what is that?
That's an airplane.
We're
quite close to a...
yeah, that's why I couldn't fly the drone. It's actually the only time I've ever... Did I tell you this earlier? It's the only time I've ever manually flown my drone because the stabilizing was actually quite good to get shots of out there. But if anybody saw me, I looked like a child. Yeah, exactly. But that's the reason why.
Yeah.
But no. Sorry, carry on. So the predators dip their head.
Yeah, not necessarily just predators, but for example, really important that you really understand those signals between these two individuals of like, okay, you're not going to eat me if I come up and clean you. And just recognizing that if I came up and tilted my body in a particular way, these cleaner wrasse were like, oh, are you going to get cleaned? Should we be cleaning you? And they'd come up and they'd be like, you're weird. Like, you don't wear your scales. Like, I don't, and they wouldn't be sure. And I just think, situating your space where your signals are communicating so much, and you're trying to understand how, when you're in this space, to interpret what's going on around you, but also how they're interpreting you. And I think that gives you a bit of a humility space, of like, okay, what am I conveying? Also the fact that underwater we are the clumsiest probably of species wandering through those environments. And the fact that...
big.
Yeah, but big to some extent sometimes. But if you think of like a tiger shark swimming past you, we're probably not massive. No. Blue whale, definitely we're not particularly significant in size. But when you think of the fact that many sharks can really like feel your heartbeat underwater, and that's something that's detectable for them, then you suddenly realize there's this amount of communication of how calm you are, how relaxed you are, how open you are for this space. And they're picking that up and they're deciding, are you dangerous to me or are we safe in this space together? And I think that I found that I keep thinking back of that, and it refreshes the idea of what do these different signals mean? What do these different senses and how we use them voluntarily and involuntarily? Like, I can't control my heartbeat. I might try, but there's a lot I'm communicating there that I'm not aware of. And so that idea of listening, I think you're situating yourself in how do you want to also be heard, and how do you want to interpret what you're hearing around you.
The thing I find beautiful about that is that it surely, as a practice, that can't help, that experience of being underwater and realizing how you're affecting things for better or worse, surely underneath can't help but make you recognize your own significance, that your presence matters, and where you move, how you hold yourself makes a difference in the environment. Because I think some people don't believe that, that their life really matters, or that where they are, how they hold themselves matters. Whereas, it's my contention that our presence, where we choose to be and how we show up, is everything, and what we do and say above that is like all layers. But that's certainly what I took from what you're saying. That's for somebody who doesn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to their own presence, I would imagine that being in that environment would make them aware of that.
I think it's an interesting mix. On the one hand, I find it wonderful when I feel insignificant in that space, because I like the reminder and the sort of realization that this whole environment, like if I'm swimming down in the dawn chorus, this activity, this one species, an octopus, is seeking out the eel because they're going to cooperatively hunt together, and this coral grouper comes in and joins in. They don't care if I'm there. They were going to hunt whether I was there or not.
Right, yeah.
And I love that. I love that recognition that this intricacy and interweave is happening, whether I sort of bring myself to it or not. But I agree with you that there's a real recognition as well that I have so many choices of how I'm in this space. If I was to come in and splash and make lots of noise, they would all disperse because it's not...
Like the snapping turtles that I scared off earlier when I tried to film them, and they were like, nope.
Yeah, we are a presence. Our choices have these ripples, fitting in the sort of aquatic sense, but they really do. And if you go back to, for example, diving, you can be diving in 50 different ways. One of them, the species around you feel safe with your presence, feel like you're not a threatening addition, and will be able to carry on with their life. The other is you're perhaps grabbing all sorts of things, or you're losing control and you knock over a branch of coral reef that's been growing for 10,000 years. There are very, very visceral differences there. And that's just within the choice of being in that space in that moment, doing one activity. So I think you're right that it's also how we do what we do and how we navigate where we find ourselves situated. And I think that to me feels very, I don't know if I'd say freeing, but there's this every space you're in, you're choosing how you create the ripples within it.
And I also take your point as well about the sort of the dissolving of ego, of self-importance, which is slightly different from what I'm describing about someone who doesn't recognize the power of their own presence. The sort of the false ego of, I'm so powerful, I can do things, when you're flapping around in the water, feeling extremely vulnerable. That, and, vulnerable really, that is a good practice for dissolving some of that false ego as well. So there's lots of different things to be found in the water, I guess. That give some, I don't know, reflection on normal above water life.
And there was I was reading something that I found so fascinating that was talking about a lot of people feel this when they look up to the stars, and they feel this sense of how small they are. And this, it's kind of like you said, it dissolves this sense of ego and creates often more of a sense of being unified with all those little puzzle pieces. We're all just these little puzzle pieces, and can create what they were calling pro-social behavior, which creates this desire to be perhaps more cooperative because you're all working on it together. You're all this little piece. And I think that just also shows how just because you're not, it sort of dissolves that sense of ego. It doesn't take away any of the positive impact that you can have as an individual, because it's more of how do you integrate yourself in that collective effort. And I think that can be really rewarding as well, because you're equally humbled, but then also connecting with those around you in something that's larger than just you, or larger than just your goals. And I think that can be really inspiring.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. Dr. Isla Keijse Davidson, is there anything else you want to say to anybody listening and point them to find out more about your stuff?
I think that what I'd like to say is, we've just finished our second year of the World Oceans Passive Acoustic Monitoring Project, which has so far been mainly a collaboration of bioacousticians. Fantastic community, but that's sort of not exclusive. What we really want to do is we want to grow in the sense that we want this to be something that people feel welcome to participate, to engage in, to listen in. Whether you're a bioacoustician or whether you're someone who's just curious and wants to perhaps know what the sounds are around the places you call home underwater nearby. And also really have that open exchange with people who are perhaps really driven and have experience in going, okay, well, it's great to listen. It's important to connect through what we hear, but also what's that next step? How do we make that impactful? How do we inform and benefit the existing conservation effort that's going out there, that's inspiring and incredible? How do we make these things work together? And I think that that's where I would just want to say that those are places I think would be so exciting to grow and to learn, and anybody has the capacity to really make that flourish. And that's not something that I think can come from just one or even just a handful of people. So that I think is, I suppose, an invite to think that anybody who has a reflection and a passion for that could have a perspective that could move that forward as a community. And I think I'd love it if people felt welcome to do that.
And with the sounds you've collected, you've made with a Colombian artist, a beautiful soundscape song of Wapam 2024, and I'll link that in below. And I think that's a good example of you connecting in a different way, trying to represent it through art, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, I think Alejandro Bernal, so a Colombian artist who Ben Gottesman put us in touch, and we wanted to see, how do you connect with these sounds that you're hearing? What does that mean? And how we're all, probably all of us are quite fond of music, some form of music in some way, and connect quite personally to the music we listen to. And how can we incorporate that? And so Alejandro really explored that and took recordings of creatures that we heard on World Oceans Day last year, and just from those sounds made a complete song. And he just created that from his inspiration, and it was really wonderful to get to see someone take their incredible skills and delve into the depths of this in their own way. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some of those sounds and try and run some analyses on them and see if we can contribute some kind of meta insight as well that might be useful to the community, but all that's still to come. Thank you so much for taking time to show me around, to walk through the woods, to see the chipmunks,
yeah, they're great.
Talk with Aaron Price and Ben and Matt, and to spend an hour or so with me talking about your stuff. It's amazing. I'm excited about what comes next, and hopefully this is the first of many recorded conversations and lots of good ones offline as well.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. The human foot is an evolutionary masterpiece. 26 bones for natural stability, over 100 muscles, tendons and ligaments for natural strength. Hundreds of thousands of nerve endings for natural sensory feeling. Just by wearing bare footwear for 6 months, feet regain their shape, sense and strength by 60%. Embrace your human nature and get 15% off your first Vivo barefoot order with this link.